G'day guys, so today we are going to be looking at how to do some editing and compression, specifically more compression of GeoTiffs using QGIS but also GIMP, image editing program. So the goal of today is basically to take some satellite imagery that we have here of the Tasman Peninsula. We're going to be compressing a geotiff of this down as much as we possibly can without losing any quality effectively, or losing as little quality as possible. So inbuilt into QGIS there is the ability to export map to an image, which will save it out as a geotiff. So we'll set our resolution to 500 dpi in this instance, so it's going to be a fairly high resolution image that we might want to zoom into later on down the track. That was a previous one. So I'm going to save it here as tasman.tiff. It looks like there are some other formats, but we're just going to stick with tiff for the moment. Because that is the most sort of flexible format that you can use. So we'll see how long that takes. There we go. So that's just rendered out. Now, what you could notice in that screen just a moment ago was that there were no real options for compression, like what sort of compression algorithm you wanted to use. Which is a contrast to when you're using other tools within QGIS. It gives you the option of what sort of compression algorithm and quality, etc. you want to use, but you don't get that in that particular screen. But what you can do, this is just like a little trick, is you can grab the TIFF that just saved out, bring it back into QGIS, and so now if I zoom out a little bit, you can see there it is. It's just the geotiff that I've exported out a moment ago. You can then re-render that, right? So you've rendered it out, and now you're going to re-render it here as a rendered image. So that's going to be an 8-bit TIFF. And if we re-render that out, this is the part where we start to get our options. So I've got my default options with the compression being default deflate. Yep, which is what we want. And so I'm going to render that out, going to render that again. So we're going to call that Tasman, we'll just call it version 2, right? We're re-rendering it. And so we'll see what we can get after we render that out. That completed fairly quickly. And if we jump in here, we can have a look at the size difference. So the original one is 88 megabytes. And once we've put it back into QGIS and re-rendered, we've brought it down to 20 megabytes. So that is the biggest reduction that we are going to see, is putting it back into QGIS to sort of re-render it. So that's great. We've dropped it down to 20 megabytes, but we can do better than that. So what we're going to do now is bring it into a program called GIMP. If you haven't used GIMP before, then I really recommend downloading it. It's a very flexible and handy program to have. So I'm just going to close off the previous one I had. And one thing that's a functionality within the most recent version of GIMP, you can see I'm using this version here, is the ability to export as a geotiff, which we'll see in just a moment. So first things first, before I get into compression within GIMP, I just thought I'd mention that GIMP can be handy for doing more than just compression. You can do a bunch of other enhancements. So for example, let's say you wanted to make your imagery more clear, add some contrast to it. There's a tool here called Unsharp Mask, which, as you can see by this editing, I'm just going to crank it up to an extreme amount. You can increase the contrast in your image, which can be handy in some situations. There are other things you can do as well. For example, let's just say there was a very specific Google watermark that you wanted to get rid of, and you can use a plugin called Wreath Synthesizer. This does take a bit to get working, but you can use a plugin called Wreath Synthesizer to do something called a heal selection, which is effectively equivalent to Photoshop's content-aware fill. If we hit OK, bang, it just sort of uses AI to fill in the gap and remove the logo. So that is something that you do have the ability to do. But we're not going to be focusing on all the great things you can do to your image, including ridiculous things like turning the saturation way up if you wanted to. We're going to be looking specifically at compression and how we can reduce the file size even further than what you can do in QGIS. One thing that you notice is that there are all these Google logos out here which are going to be taking up space within the image. There's also some pixel color differences out here in the ocean. Now we don't care about detail out there, we only care about the detail here on the land. So I'm going to use this smudge tool here in GIMP to smudge away all of the little sort of pixelations as well as Google logos out in the ocean. This isn't going to have a great effect because the ocean was already not super detailed, so it wasn't probably taking up a huge amount of the file size of the GeoTiff, but we'll just see if it has any sort of effect anyway. So we'll export this out as Tasman version 3. And critically, when we get into this export stage, we're going to make sure that we have save geotiff data ticked on. This is only a relatively recent feature, and for our compression algorithm we're going to choose deflate because that reduces the file size the greatest amount within the lossless compression algorithms that you can choose between. And let's see if we've actually done anything or not. One thing you notice is that Windows no longer knows how to preview it, but we have. You notice we've just dropped it from 20 megabytes down to 18. How much of that is a difference in what we've just done to the ocean, and how much of that is a difference in the exporting algorithm of GIMP versus QGIS, I don't know, but we have just dropped it down another 2 megabytes. But we can do better. We can get this compressed down even further. One thing, let's just say for example that you have this satellite image here, and most of the time you'll be zoomed out, but when you do zoom in you only really care about this sort of central section, and you're not too stressed about zooming in on the outer part here. So if I select this area here, let's just say that this part here of the land, if it becomes a little bit lower quality, it's not a drama because you don't need to zoom in on it. What you can do is use a tool called dither. So if we go into colors, we go into dither, and then make sure we set the dithering method to none. You notice that what's happened is that if we sort of flick it on and off, what it's doing is it's reducing the number of colors. It's effectively reducing the bit depth of this section of the image. And so we're not going to have it this extreme. We want to have it so that it's only sort of just noticeable. So for the red levels, let's maybe take it to red, green, blue levels, let's maybe take it to 23. Now if we turn this effect on and off, you notice that out at this zoom level you can't really notice a difference that it's having, but if you zoom in on the pixels you can then notice there's a more significant difference once you've zoomed in. But you know, as we mentioned before, we only care about this area here in the center, so if we're losing quality on the edge, that's not a drama. So we're going to go ahead and apply this dither to the edge, reduce the bit depth there of the edge, and now let's export that out and see if we get much of a difference in file size. Tasman version 4, deflate, save geotiff data. Now hopefully we've dropped a little bit in size, so we've gone from 18.5 megabytes down to 15.5 megabytes. So there you go, we've just dropped another 3 megabytes in file size. Now the thing with this is that this whole time we've been using deflate, which is a lossless compression algorithm. But for an image like this, which is a satellite image as opposed to something like a topographic map, for a satellite image it's probably more appropriate to use JPEG compression as the compression algorithm. So let's see what sort of effect we can have with that, and that will compound with what we've done to the ocean and the dithering to the land. Instead of choosing deflate, we're going to choose JPEG. We're going to get some lossy compression, which is really going to help out the file size here in these sort of treed areas. But keep in mind that, like I said, for a topographic map that's not going to be as appropriate as a lossless compression algorithm. So we've just gone from 15.5 megabytes down to 5 megabytes, so huge difference. And I mean, depending, so Windows Explorer doesn't know how to, or Windows Photo Viewer doesn't know how to open that, but I promise you it does work if we try and slide that into QGIS. There you go, it understands the image, and you can see that you can see these sort of square things appearing here. You can see the lossy compression starting to take an effect, and that's, like I said, not a drama in these satellite images, but do know that if you are making a topographic style map, it's going to actually be worse to go with JPEG compression over lossless compression such as deflate. So here's our JPEG compressed TIFF, and if we compare that to the lossless compressed deflate, you can see we're losing some quality in going from deflate into JPEG, but as we noticed, the file size went from 15 down to 5 megabytes. So those are some of the options and techniques you can use in QGIS as well as GIMP in order to reduce the size of your GeoTiffs. And obviously this won't necessarily affect how quickly it's going to render within a program, but at least it's going to take up less file size on your hard drive, which when you're dealing with gigantic images may be of a lot of importance to you. Also keep in mind that if you're doing this on a big scale, then actually none of this is going to be appropriate for you necessarily, or at least deflate or JPEG won't be appropriate for you. JPEG 2000 will be most appropriate. That's something I've noticed that the state government does here when they're storing huge satellite images. They've realized that JPEG 2000 provides the best results for them because it means they can they can compress in a lossy way the image without losing the detail as much as JPEG compression does. So JPEG 2000 is what you want to jump onto if you're doing some serious compression. But anyway, there's some interesting techniques. Let me know if you have any dramas, any questions, any comments you want to leave. Just drop them down below, and that's about it for today.